What if I told you that the crushing weight of your student loans or the astronomical price of your groceries and even your inability to secure a mortgage? What if they aren't just, unfortunate economic cycles?
Right.
What if they are actually the direct required fuel for a geopolitical strategy operating like 6,000 miles away? Today, we are mapping out a theory of the world that connects the collapse of the middle class right here at home to the threat of drone swarms in the Persian Gulf.
It is a massive scope.
It really is. We're looking at a stack of sources you shared with us featuring the highly provocative analysis of geopolitical thinker Cyrus Modad. And his central thesis is just staggering. I mean, he argues we are witnessing the end of traditional statecraft.
Completely replaced by something else.
Exactly.
Oh.
Replaced by a system driven by a entrenched elite oligarchy, perpetual war, and something he specifically calls chaos as policy.
And before we dive into the deep end of these muddy waters, let's just establish a quick ground rule for everyone listening. The material we are unpacking today pulls absolutely no punches.
None at all.
It takes direct aim at the foreign policies of the United States, Israel, Iran, and leadership across both the left and right wings of the political spectrum. It also, delves heavily into religious ideologies. So, just to be absolutely clear up front, we aren't here to judge these claims, endorse them, or take sides.
Right.
We are simply your guides. Our job today is to just break down the mechanics of Modad's arguments, impartially report on the sources you provided, and help you understand the underlying logic of this worldview so you can, weigh the evidence for yourself.
Exactly. We're here to deconstruct the engine, not tell you whether to buy the car.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the first piece of this engine we really need to take apart is our fundamental understanding of diplomacy itself.
Yeah, the whole concept of it.
Right. Growing up, the narrative is always that diplomacy is the ultimate goal, right? You get adversarial leaders in a room, you grind out some sort of compromise, and you avoid dropping bombs. But Modad's analysis completely shatters that premise.
It totally flips it.
He argues that international negotiations, particularly regarding the Middle East right now, are no longer about achieving peace at all. They are actually being utilized as a tactical smokescreen for military strikes.
It's a deeply, deeply cynical view of statecraft. But he points to a very specific, recent diplomatic sequence to illustrate exactly how this dynamic actually functions in the real world. The sources detail this period of back-channel negotiations between the United States and Iran, which were mediated by Oman.
Okay.
Now, according to the Omani foreign minister, who actually explicitly stated this after the fact, an agreement was essentially in hand, like the negotiations were working.
Which, frankly, is wild to hear, because the public narrative we get fed constantly is that these talks are just endlessly gridlocked. That Iran is completely unyielding and no progress can ever be made.
Right, but according to the sources, Iran had actually conceded on the major sticking point.
They really had.
They had. And to understand the sheer magnitude of that, we have to look at the mechanics of the core issue here, which is Iran's nuclear program. In these Omani talks, Iran agreed to cap their uranium enrichment at 60%.
Okay, wait, let's break that down. 60%. What does that actually mean in terms of building a weapon?
Well, to give you the technical context, uranium enrichment isn't like a linear threat. Getting from 0 to 20% is incredibly difficult. It requires massive infrastructure.
Right, giant centrifuges, all that.
Exactly. But getting from 60% up to 90%, which is the actual threshold needed for a viable modern nuclear weapon, is technically a much, much shorter jump. But Iran agreed to stay at 60, and they agreed to get rid of their highly enriched stockpile.
Wow.
And crucially, they agreed to remain under the constant physical and electronic surveillance of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
Right, so they keep the base capability to enrich, which I guess they view as a matter of national sovereignty and civilian energy.
Yeah, they insist on that.
But they effectively surrender the actual pathway to building a bomb. Because, if you have IAEA cameras in your facilities and literal inspectors walking on the floors, you literally cannot make that final jump to 90% weapons-grade material without alarms going off in Vienna and Washington within hours, right?
Precisely. The verification mechanism was basically the lock on the door. As the Omani mediators saw it, the nuclear threat was solved. It was done. But then the deal violently falls apart.
First collapses.
Yeah. And Modad offers this fascinating, if dark, explanation for why. He points to the personnel running the back-channel negotiations for the American side.
Okay, who was running it?
Well, the text specifically highlights Steve Witkoff, who was a New York real estate developer, and Jared Kushner.
Wait, real estate
Yes,
developers?
and the crucial mechanism of influence Modad highlights here is that Kushner's family has deep, decades-long personal and financial ties with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Oh, I see. He literally describes them as best friends with Netanyahu in the text, right?
He does. So the argument here is that you have these negotiations ostensibly brokered by the United States government, but effectively steered by individuals whose primary alignment is with the specific regional goals of the Israeli leadership.
Okay, that completely changes the dynamic of the room.
Yes. And because of that alignment, Modad argues these talks were fundamentally never meant to work. They were just a stalling tactic. And we see this play out chronologically in the sources you shared.
Right, the timeline is crazy.
In June of 2025, an Israeli military attack occurred just like 1 or 2 days before the Americans and Iranians were actually scheduled to meet to finalize these very successful negotiations.
Which feels entirely deliberate. I mean, the sources even draw a parallel to strikes against Hamas negotiators in Qatar right when those specific ceasefire talks seem to be making progress.
Exactly the same pattern.
It paints this incredibly dark picture where the negotiation table isn't a place for resolution at all. It's literally just a place to hold your enemy's attention while you maneuver your pieces on the board to strike them.
But we have to ask the critical question here. If the nuclear issue was actually solved, as the Omanis believed it was, why strike? Like, why blow up the deal?
Yeah, if the nukes are off the table, what's the problem?
The answer reveals a fundamental misunderstanding most people have about the geopolitics of the region. According to the sources, Israel's true, immediate existential fear isn't actually a nuclear Iran.
Wait, really? That goes against everything we hear.
A nuclear weapon is a massive strategic deterrent, yes. But the immediate tactical nightmare for the Israeli state is Iran's vast, highly advanced arsenal of conventional ballistic missiles.
Okay, let's really dig into that, because that completely shifts the paradigm. Why are conventional missiles, things that just, blow up normally without radiation, such a massive game changer that you would sabotage a nuclear peace treaty over them?
It all comes down to physical geography and infrastructural vulnerability. Israel is a geographically tiny nation.
Right.
Modad points out that it only takes a handful of precise, conventional missile hits to fundamentally wreck the country's ability to function as a modern state. Let's just look at the targets he lists in the text.
Okay.
First, a couple of vital reverse osmosis desalination plants. Israel relies on these plants for a massive percentage of its drinking water. If a missile hits the intake valves or the high-pressure pumps of a desalination facility, a major city loses water within 48 hours.
I mean, it's not like you can just quickly patch a highly complex pressurized filtration system while you're actively under fire.
Exactly. It takes months to rebuild. Then add in maybe 4 functioning commercial ports, a major chemicals complex, a few oil refineries, and 3 civilian airports.
So if you manage to overwhelm the Iron Dome and just hit those specific nodes, you don't even need a nuke to collapse the state.
You don't.
You just need enough GPS-guided conventional missiles to hit the water, the power grid, and the fuel supply. The whole society just grinds to a halt.
And that is the exact mechanism of vulnerability. So in the eyes of the Israeli security apparatus, as analyzed by Modad, accepting a diplomatic deal that only puts a lid on the nuclear issue is entirely insufficient for their actual survival.
Because the conventional missiles are still pointed at the water plants.
Right. They feel they absolutely must neutralize the conventional missile threat as well. But rather than attempt to negotiate that away, which honestly Iran would never agree to, the sources suggest the diplomatic track was basically used to buy time.
To buy time, gather intelligence, and set the stage for military action to degrade those conventional capabilities.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to jump in here and wrestle with this logic for a second.
Yeah.
If I'm looking at this from a pure long-term game theory perspective, using diplomacy as a literal trap feels incredibly short-sighted.
It does seem risky.
It's like setting up a massive, highly publicized peace summit with your rival, waiting for them to literally lower their shields to shake your hand, and then you just pull a gun. It might work brilliantly the first time, it might even work a second time, but eventually, won't you run out of people willing to talk to you? How does a state survive in a highly volatile region when absolutely zero trust remains?
That's the big question.
When the entire concept of a ceasefire or a diplomatic treaty is viewed by all your neighbors as a lethal trick.
It's the most logical counterargument. If you destroy the very mechanism of diplomacy, how do you ever end a conflict?
Yeah.
How do you achieve any sort of stability?
Exactly.
But that question assumes that the ultimate goal of these actors is stability, mutual trust, and a neat, peaceful resolution.
Oh.
Modad's terrifying thesis is that establishing trust is absolutely not the goal. The goal is the exact opposite.
Which brings us to the absolute core of this deep dive, the overarching strategy that Modad calls chaos as policy.
Precisely. If diplomacy is an illusion, what is the reality on the ground? The reality, according to these sources, is a deliberate, meticulously executed strategy of fostering failed states.
Failed states.
Yeah. Modad claims that Israel's ultimate, long-term security strategy, which is supported by its Western allies, is to ensure that it is surrounded entirely by states that are either completely collapsed or so economically and politically dysfunctional that they cannot pose a unified, conventional military threat.
So the doctrine isn't about building a prosperous neighborhood where everyone trades and gets along. It's about making sure your neighbors' houses are perpetually on fire.
Yes.
Or, in such severe disrepair that they can't even think about coming over to your yard to cause trouble.
That's a very apt way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And the sources provide a historical roadmap showing how this mechanism has been implemented over decades. Look at the immediate borders.
Okay.
Israel officially made peace with Egypt and Jordan. But Modad argues this wasn't a peace born of mutual prosperity or deep trust. He claims Egypt and Jordan are pacified because they're kept on a tight economic leash.
Like through debt.
Exactly. Trapped in massive, insurmountable webs of international debt. They are given just enough financial life support through institutions like the IMF to remain functional states. But they are far too economically paralyzed to ever project power or challenge the status quo.
They're too busy trying to scrape together the interest payments on their national mortgage to build a modern military.
Exactly. The debt is the pacifier. Then you move outward to the next ring of neighbors. Look at Syria.
Right.
Modad asserts that the Syrian state was effectively destroyed because the West and its regional allies intentionally backed radical Sunni jihadist groups to overthrow the government in Damascus.
And what was the tactical goal there?
The strategic mechanism was to sever the axis of resistance supply line, the physical route that runs from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and into Lebanon to supply Hezbollah.
Ah, so you break the bridge. And the sources claim this exact same lens is now being applied to Turkey, right?
Yes. Modad notes that Israeli officials are actually starting to label Turkey as the next Iran, meaning any state in the region that becomes sufficiently powerful, unified, economically independent, or autonomous is automatically viewed as an inherent threat that must be actively destabilized.
Wow. And now the ultimate target of this chaos as policy strategy is Iran itself.
Right.
The sources detail the specific mechanics of how this destabilization is allegedly being executed. It's not just about direct conventional bombing campaigns, is it?
No, it's about funding, arming, and exploiting internal ethnic and religious divisions. Modad claims Western intelligence and allied networks are backing Kurdish insurgents in the northwest of Iran, Baluchi separatist fighters near the Pakistani border in the southeast.
Just lighting fires everywhere.
And they're even recycling those same Syrian jihadis we just talked about.
Wait, recycling them?
Yeah, moving them into Iraq to use them as a proxy force against Iran and its allies.
It's almost like a franchise model of destabilization. You take the hardened fighters that successfully wrecked the infrastructure of Syria, pack them up, ship them across the border, and set up a new franchise on the Iranian border to do the exact same thing.
It's the deliberate weaponization of radicalism. And the sources point out that this is a recurring historical pattern. They mention this same dynamic occurring in Bosnia, Chechnya, Afghanistan in the 1980s, and Syria.
So the playbook never changes.
You cultivate a radical non-state threat, use it as a proxy battering ram against your primary sovereign enemy, and attempt to collapse that enemy state from the inside out. The explicit goal here is to plunge Iran into a full-scale civil war, to break the state apparatus so completely that it becomes another fractured Libya or another burning Syria.
Okay, let's play this out to its logical conclusion, because this is where the extrapolation in the source material gets genuinely terrifying for the rest of the world. Let's say the strategy works perfectly. The regime in Tehran falls. The central government collapses. You don't get a nice, compliant, liberal democracy springing up from the ashes to sell you cheap oil, right?
Absolutely not. Modad is brutally clear about the grim reality of state collapse. You get what he describes as a million little Saddams.
A million little Saddams.
If the central authority falls, the massive territory of Iran gets carved up by warring factions. Various Shia militias, Kurdish nationalist groups, Sunni extremist factions, local warlords.
None of whom have any international constraints.
Exactly. No diplomatic ties and no incentive to play by global rules. You replace one predictable, albeit highly adversarial, state actor with dozens of wildly unpredictable, heavily armed, non-state actors.
And this is where the sources brought up that incredibly chilling historical comparison to the assassins.
Yes, the Order of Assassins. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, this radical sect exerted massive, disproportionate influence over the entire Middle East.
But they didn't do it with a huge army.
They didn't do it with a massive standing army or by building a traditional empire. They held power from a decentralized network of mountain fortresses, and they controlled the region through the constant, asymmetric threat of targeted murder.
Just fear.
Their leverage was purely psychological. They essentially communicated to the ruling sultans, "We can't defeat your army of 10,000 men on a battlefield, but we can easily slip into your palace and murder you in your sleep."
And Modad is saying, take that ancient model of asymmetric terror, but update the technology for the 21st century.
Exactly. Fast forward to a collapsed, failed state of Iran, fractured into warlord territories. But these modern warlords have access to infinite, incredibly cheap drone technology.
Right.
They don't need to spend millions of dollars on a fighter jet, and they don't need to send a guy with a dagger. For a few $1,000s, they can launch a swarm of GPS-guided loitering munitions at any oil tanker passing by, any refinery on the coast, or any power plant in the region.
They sit geographically right on top of the world's most vital energy lifeline, armed with the ability to extort the entire globe. Yeah. But wait, I have to ask a grounding question here on behalf of anyone listening who is trying to find the rational logic in all of this. Because if you live in a nice house, why would you actively want your entire neighborhood to become a burning, toxic landfill?
It's a fair question.
I completely understand wanting your neighbors to be militarily weaker than you, but doesn't chaos as policy mathematically guarantee that the chaos, the smoke, the refugees, the radicalism will eventually spill over your own borders?
It seems inevitable, yeah.
How is a failed state next door, armed with infinite, untraceable drone swarms, somehow better or safer than a unified state that you can at least negotiate with or conventionally deter?
That is the exact piercing critique Modad levels at this policy. He views it as a fundamentally arrogant and remarkably stupid strategy because it completely ignores second and third order consequences.
Right.
To answer your question, yes, the chaos is spilling over. It always does. But what the sources reveal is that the first major casualty of the spillover isn't necessarily a physical border wall being breached, it's the global economy. Yeah.
Which brings us perfectly into the economic implications of this chaos, because they are staggering. And it all centers around what Modad outlines as Iran's Samson option.
Yes.
We all know the cultural reference of Samson from the biblical story, right?
Yes.
Captured by his enemies, blinded, chained to the supporting pillars of their massive temple.
Right.
His final desperate act was to use all his remaining strength to push the pillars apart, bringing the entire roof down, crushing himself, but also crushing everyone else in the building.
It is the ultimate doctrine of mutually assured destruction. If I go down, we all go down.
Exactly.
In geopolitical terms, Israel has long been rumored to possess a nuclear Samson option. The idea that if the state is overrun, they will launch their nuclear arsenal at every enemy capital.
Yeah.
But Modad argues that Iran has cultivated an economic Samson option.
An economic one.
Yes, if they are pushed to the absolute brink, if they feel their state is about to collapse under the weight of this Western bad chaos policy, their trump card isn't a nuke. Their trump card is the ability to systematically shut down the global energy supply.
And the truly scary part of this deep dive is that, according to the sources, they've already started running the beta tests for this. This isn't just theoretical wargaming in some Washington think tank.
No, the mechanism has already been demonstrated. The sources detail a series of highly targeted, precise strikes that Iran has already executed as warnings to the region.
Like what?
Well, they hit Qatari gas infrastructure. The result? They forced Qatar to temporarily shut down massive portions of their liquid natural gas and aluminum production.
Just to tap on the shoulder.
Exactly. Then they hit the UAE ports of Fujairah and Jebel Ali. Now, we need to understand the significance of Fujairah. It's a massive oil bunkering hub specifically built on the Gulf of Oman side of the peninsula.
And why is that important?
Because it was designed to allow ships to load oil without having to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. By hitting Fujairah, Iran was sending a very clear technical message. You cannot build a pipeline to bypass us. We can hit your workarounds.
Oh, wow. So no loopholes.
None. They also hit the Saudi refineries at Ras Tanura, which is essentially the beating heart of Saudi Arabian oil exports. And they've hit commercial shipping off the coast of Kuwait.
So they are systematically tapping every major economic player in the region on the shoulder and saying, look closely at what we can do with a few cheap drones.
Right.
But the real choke point, the absolute nightmare scenario that Modad focuses on, is the Strait of Hormuz itself.
Yes, and we need to paint a vivid geographical picture of what this waterway actually looks like, because it is entirely unique. A lot of people casually compare it to the Red Sea, where we've seen the Houthis causing major shipping disruptions.
Right, but the Red Sea is pretty wide in comparison.
Exactly. In the Red Sea, international shipping lanes can stay relatively far from the Yemeni coast. The Strait of Hormuz is completely different. It is an incredibly narrow band of water.
How narrow?
At its narrowest point, the navigable shipping lanes are only a couple of miles wide, and they literally have to hug the Iranian coastline and weave through Iranian-controlled islands.
Right. Modad points out that as a massive, slow-moving oil tanker passes through, it is physically vulnerable to attack from 3 different directions simultaneously.
You can't just sail down the middle of the ocean and ignore the coast.
No, you are right in their backyard, driving past mountains where they have hidden mobile anti-ship missile batteries.
And the global stakes couldn't be higher. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil exports and a massive percentage of the world's liquefied natural gas flow through that single, highly vulnerable passage.
20%. That's massive.
Most of it goes to Asian markets, places like China, Japan, and South Korea, which serve as the manufacturing engine of the globalized economy. A significant portion also goes to Europe.
So if Iran decides to execute the Samson option and permanently shut down commercial shipping through Hormuz, using those infinite cheap drones, sea mines, and anti-ship missiles,
The math is simple. The global economy breaks.
it's an instant, massive shock to the system. You don't just lose oil, you lose the maritime insurance market. No insurance company on Earth will underwrite a tanker sailing into a guaranteed kill zone, which means the ships simply stop sailing.
Exactly. And the ripple effects trigger astronomical global inflation within days. Every industrial product manufactured in Asia, every automotive part, every medical supply, and crucially, agricultural commodities and fertilizers.
Everything.
The price of all of it skyrockets because the chemical inputs and the fuel required to transport them across the ocean just vanish or become prohibitively expensive.
And the devastation doesn't stop at shipping lanes. Modad also points out the extreme physical fragility of the Gulf states themselves. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar.
Right. Remember the reverse osmosis desalination plants we mentioned in Israel?
Yes.
The massive wealthy cities of the Gulf, Dubai, Doha, Riyadh, are completely reliant on them. They exist in a desert. If Iran, in its death throes as a state, decides to unleash its missile arsenal on the desalination plants and power grids of the Arabian Peninsula, they can essentially make the entire region uninhabitable in a matter of weeks.
Which triggers another massive secondary economic domino that most people never think about: the remittance lifeline.
The human cost of this is staggering. Millions of migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan live and work in the Gulf.
Right.
They build the cities, run the service industry, and send billions of dollars in remittances back to their home countries. For nations like Pakistan or Egypt, those remittances are a foundational pillar of their national economy.
So if the Gulf economies collapse because their water and power infrastructure is destroyed, those workers flee, and those remittances stop overnight.
You suddenly have massive currency crises, food shortages, and potential state failures cascading across all of South Asia and North Africa.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I've been trying to visualize this strategy, and I keep thinking about it like a game of Monopoly. Yeah. Imagine you are playing Monopoly. And over the course of the game, you slowly realize that the other players have colluded. They've bought all the properties, they control the bank, they've written the rules to ensure you always land in jail, and the game is fundamentally rigged against you.
Okay, I see where you're going.
You know mathematically you can't win by rolling the dice anymore, so what's your only logical move? You flip the board.
You destroy the game itself.
Yeah.
If you can't win, you make sure nobody can play.
Exactly. If Iran knows it cannot possibly defeat the United States military and its allies in a conventional head-to-head war because no nation on Earth can match that firepower, Their only logical strategic move is to flip the global board.
Right.
To make the conflict so economically painful, so globally catastrophic through inflation and supply chain collapse, that the U.S. and its allies simply cannot afford to sustain the war. They weaponize the very interconnected fragility of the globalized economy against the West.
And Modad points out that this puts a Western world in a bizarre, unprecedented lose-lose situation. It's an asymmetric war where a sovereign nation-state is intentionally behaving like a cornered insurgency, utilizing global economic pain as its primary weapon.
But listen, this raises a glaring, massive question. If I'm sitting here listening to this, I'm thinking, if a full-scale war with Iran guarantees a global energy shutdown, astronomical inflation that will crush the middle class, and the potential collapse of allied economies, why on earth are Western leaders actively pursuing it?
It seems counterintuitive.
Why is chaos as policy the playbook if the outcome is guaranteed severe economic pain for the average citizen?
And this is exactly where Modad's analysis shifts from regional geopolitics to the underlying nature of power itself. To answer your question of why, he argues we have to follow the money. We have to look at who actually profits from the machine functioning this way.
And who is that?
The answer, according to the deep dive into these sources, is an entrenched elite oligarchy.
Modad makes a claim here that is incredibly cynical, but he backs it up with a distinct historical pattern. He argues that in the West, and specifically in the United States, the politicians you vote for are essentially irrelevant to the actual formulation of foreign policy.
It's a bold, sweeping claim. But look at the timeline he lays out in the text. He argues that you can swap the figureheads in the Oval Office, you can change the party in power, but the structural playbook never changes.
Give me some examples from the text.
He notes that Bill Clinton promised domestic focus and restraint, but then heavily engaged in the Balkans and expanded NATO. George W. Bush campaigned explicitly against nation-building, heavily criticizing Clinton's foreign interventions.
Right, I remember that.
Yet once in office, he delivered the massive multi-trillion-dollar wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Then Barack Obama wins the presidency, largely propelled by a grassroots movement demanding an end to the Bush-era wars and promising a new era of foreign policy restraint.
And according to the sources, despite the rhetoric, the mechanism of intervention continued. He delivered new military campaigns in Libya, drone wars across the region, and deep involvement in Syria.
Then Donald Trump wins, railing against the stupid, endless wars in the Middle East.
Yet his administration relentlessly escalates tensions with Iran, tears up the nuclear deal, and ramps up the maximum pressure campaign. Modad's stark conclusion is that the voter's choice at the ballot box doesn't matter because the elected politicians are not the actual decision makers.
Nor are they the primary financial beneficiaries of these policies.
Exactly.
Okay, so if the politicians aren't the ones truly driving the car or benefiting from the destination, who is?
The sources point directly to the military-industrial complex, but Modad updates this concept for the 21st century by analyzing it specifically through the lens of modern finance.
Modern finance.
He says this perpetual state of war, this constant simmering chaos, is absolutely fantastic for the shareholders of massive defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon.
Okay, but who are those shareholders?
And when you look at who those major institutional shareholders actually are, you don't just find individual wealthy people. You find massive, monolithic asset management firms. The text specifically names BlackRock and Vanguard.
Okay, so massive institutional wealth. But we really need to explain the mechanism here. How do asset managers in New York actually dictate foreign policy in Washington? How does an index fund cause a war?
It's about concentrated leverage. Firms like BlackRock and Vanguard manage trillions of dollars, often comprising the retirement funds of everyday citizens.
Right.
Because they hold such massive blocks of shares across the entire defense sector, they exert outsized voting power on corporate boards. They can dictate corporate strategy, which includes lobbying efforts.
Ah.
These defense companies spend billions lobbying Congress, funding think tanks that produce policy papers, advocating for intervention, and funneling money into campaign super PACs.
So Modad argues this creates a closed loop where the financial sector incentivizes the defense sector to push the government into perpetual conflict, ensuring the stock prices continue to rise.
Yes. And this is where the sources dive into what Modad calls the Epstein network. He uses the Jeffrey Epstein scandal not just as a story of personal horrific depravity, but as a structural proxy, a symbol for how elite capture actually functions behind closed doors.
Yes. Modad uses the Epstein network to illustrate how a specific insulated group of elite megadonors, intelligence assets, and financiers exert direct control over elected officials across the entire political spectrum.
He argues this network is the physical manifestation of a deeply entrenched oligarchy that operates above the law and above the voters.
And the sources provide some very specific, alleged examples of how this financial leverage controls politicians.
They do. To illustrate how candidates are vetted by this oligarchy, the text claims that early in his career, Senator Marco Rubio was essentially audited by major pro-Israel financial interests to ensure his foreign policy alignment was absolute.
Audited.
Yes, and only after passing this ideological vetting did Larry Ellison, the billionaire founder of Oracle, decide to heavily finance his political ascent.
The sources also point to the Trump administration. We already talked about Jared Kushner, a real estate heir with no diplomatic background, running the incredibly sensitive Iran negotiations.
Right.
But the text also notes the financial crossover. Kushner later brought Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, directly into high-level negotiations regarding the economic rebuilding of Ukraine.
And Modad is very careful to note that this capture is entirely bipartisan and international. He points to the Obama administration executing deals that heavily benefited the Rothschild banking family.
It's everywhere.
He traces deep structural ties within UK politics, highlighting connections from Peter Mandelson in the left-leaning Labour Party to George Osborne in the right-leaning Conservative Party.
So Modad argues they are all part of the exact same massive transatlantic club that facilitates war profiteering and implements a rigidly unified foreign policy, regardless of what the voters actually demand.
Yes.
I have to pause here and really push back on this because I want to make sure we are rigorously testing these claims. If I'm listening to this, my natural skepticism is flaring up. Is this really an orchestrated, smoke-filled room, mustache-twirling oligarchy where billionaires sit around a table and explicitly plan wars? Or is it much more likely just the natural, messy, bureaucratic momentum of a massive military-industrial complex that runs on autopilot?
The inertia argument.
Yeah, I mean, think about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. The defense contractors hated it, the generals advised against it, but the political system eventually forced it through. Doesn't that prove that politicians do still have power, and the system is just incredibly sluggish, rather than it being a tightly controlled, malicious conspiracy?
That is the most robust defense of the system.
Yeah.
The bureaucratic inertia argument.
Yeah.
That it's not evil. It's just a giant, slow-moving machine.
Exactly.
But Modad anticipates that counter-argument. His response, based on the sources, is that while bureaucratic inertia exists, the overarching direction of the machine is intentionally rigged. And he points to the media landscape as the primary evidence of intentional orchestrated control.
Right. How the information ecosystem is managed.
Exactly. Modad argues that to maintain an oligarchy that actively harms its own citizens' economic interests, you have to ensure the public never fully realizes how the system operates. You have to control the narrative.
Makes sense.
And he points out how unbelievably consolidated media ownership has become, mirroring the consolidation in the defense sector. He notes that Larry Ellison, the same billionaire who heavily financed Rubio's political career, also bought massive stakes in CBS and TikTok.
Oh, wow.
And on the other side of the perceived political aisle, you have Rupert Murdoch controlling the massive reach of Fox News.
So his point is that if the exact same elite financial class that profits from defense contracting and foreign intervention also owns the literal channels through which you get your nightly news, you are never going to see a genuine anti-war, anti-oligarchy narrative gain any real traction.
Precisely. The mechanism of control is distraction. He argues the media system is purposefully designed to keep you fiercely arguing about domestic culture war issues or hyper-partisan political scandals.
While the fundamental economic reality and the perpetual foreign policy agenda remain completely untouched and unexamined, regardless of who occupies the White House.
Right.
And this brings us to a truly crucial pivot in our deep dive. Because this perpetual war machine doesn't just drop bombs overseas, it doesn't just destabilize the Middle East. Modad argues that it drops massive, devastating economic bombs right in your own backyard.
This is where the theory of systemic blowback comes in. This is where abstract geopolitics physically hits your wallet, your family planning, and your local community.
Modad makes the argument that the blowback of chaos as policy is the intentional degradation of Western domestic stability. I want to stress that word, intentional.
Yeah, that's key.
This isn't just an accidental side effect of bad foreign policy. According to the sources, it's a required part of the cycle.
To explain the mechanics of this, he connects three massive societal dots: war, migration, and debt. Let's walk through the causal logic. First, the West implements foreign policies that wreck sovereign nations.
Like bombing Libya into a failed state, backing proxies that destroy Syria, and potentially utilizing the chaos strategy against Iran.
Exactly. And the immediate physical consequence of creating a failed state is a massive million-strong refugee crisis.
And where do displaced people naturally go when their infrastructure is destroyed? They flow toward the perceived safety and economic opportunity of the West.
Exactly. Modad points out the deep, cynical paradox of this era. Western governments endlessly import migrants from the very countries their own foreign policies are actively destroying.
Right.
This sudden, massive influx of population stresses domestic infrastructure, drives up housing costs, strains local social services, and creates deep social and cultural friction at home. It keeps the domestic population divided and unstable.
It's a self-inflicted wound. You bomb a country, you create a humanitarian crisis, and then you absorb the crisis into your own working-class neighborhoods, while the defense contractors and gated communities reap the profits.
And that leads to the third dot.
Yeah.
Debt. How does the government pay for these endless multi-trillion-dollar wars? How do they manage the massive social costs of systemic blowback? How do they cope with the inflation we discussed regarding the energy markets?
They borrow.
They rely on debt.
Huh.
Massive, systemic, unpayable debt. And this is where Modad introduces a truly powerful, visceral critique of the modern Western economy. He calls it a system of engineered debt slavery.
And the most illustrative example he uses, and I promise you this is going to resonate with almost everyone listening to this right now, is the mechanism of student loans.
Yes. Let's really look at the macroeconomic history and the mechanics of the student loan system through Modad's analytical lens. Over the last 40 years, university tuition has outpaced regular inflation by staggering margins.
It's insane how expensive it is now.
Society, heavily culturally conditioned the smartest, most ambitious half of its population to believe that they must go to a university to succeed in life. But to do so, because of those inflated costs, they must sign contracts taking on massive amounts of non-dischargeable debt, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, before they even enter the workforce.
So you graduate at 22 years old, and before you have even earned your first real paycheck, your personal balance sheet is massively, overwhelmingly in the red. You are immediately trapped.
And what is the second-order consequence of saddling an entire generation with that debt? Modad argues it is an entirely intentional demographic control mechanism.
Demographic control. How so?
Think about the timeline. If you are a young adult crushed by a $1,000 a month student loan payment, you cannot save for a down payment. Therefore, you cannot afford to buy a home until you're much older.
Right, you're just renting forever.
If you cannot afford a home or achieve basic financial stability, you inherently delay or entirely abandon the idea of getting married and starting a family.
Your biological window closes while you are trying to pay off your sociology degree, which means birth rates plummet below the replacement level of 2.1, specifically among the educated middle class.
Exactly. And Modad draws a brutal, calculating conclusion from this demographic shift. By financially castrating the smartest half of the population and preventing them from reproducing and building generational wealth.
Yeah.
The system ensures that with each passing generation, the overall populace becomes statistically dumber, more desperate, highly compliant, and much easier to politically and economically control.
It is a stunning, deeply depressing way to look at it. You take your brightest minds, the people who should be innovating and building the future, and you turn them into indentured servants to the financial sector.
Because, as Modad notes, the real economy, the economy of building physical things, manufacturing goods, creating actual value, has been purposefully replaced by what he terms usury.
Usury.
The practice of making money simply by moving money around, trading complex securities and derivatives backed by the inescapable debt of 22-year-olds. He condemns this deeply.
The sources mention religious texts regarding this, right?
He notes that major historical religious texts, from traditional Christianity to Islam and even ancient Greek philosophy, all fundamentally understood that an economy built primarily on usury is inherently extractive, parasitic, and ultimately destructive to the soul of a nation.
So what does this all mean? Let's pause and synthesize this incredibly grim picture for a moment.
It's a lot.
If you are listening to this on your commute or while doing the dishes, what Modad is arguing is that the struggles you face paying for groceries because of rampant inflation, the absolute impossibility of securing a mortgage in your city, the crushing daily weight of paying off those student loans, these are not bugs in the software.
Their features.
They aren't mistakes made by bumbling, incompetent politicians who just don't understand economics. According to the sources we're analyzing, they are the required design fuel for this global oligarchy. They need you permanently in debt so you remain quiet and compliant, working constantly, while they extract the wealth of the nation to fund perpetual conflict and their own consolidation of power.
It is a bleak, sobering diagnosis of our time. And it leads us directly into the final, highly analytical phase of our deep dive. Because if you are going to operate a system this incredibly cynical and this destructive, you have to look at the psychology and the morality, or total lack thereof, driving it.
Modad spends time contrasting the strategic, psychological mindset of the West with the mindset of Iran. And he brings up the madman theory. For those unfamiliar, this is an actual documented political science concept, heavily associated with Richard Nixon during the Vietnam War and later utilized by Donald Trump. The core idea is to intentionally make your enemies think you are completely unpredictable, highly volatile, and capable of a disproportionate, massive, crazy military response to any provocation. The hope is that they back down out of sheer fear of your irrationality.
It's a strategy of manufactured instability. Both the Trump administration and Israeli leadership have utilized this strategy, acting aggressively and unpredictably to force capitulation. But the analysis in the source material explains why this specific tactic fails spectacularly when applied against a deeply religious, ideologically driven state like Iran.
Why does it fail?
To understand the mechanics of why it fails, you have to understand the core of Shia theology.
The sources reference a very specific historical event that anchors this mindset, the Battle of Karbala. Let's unpack the history there because it's vital.
In the 7th century, Hussein ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, was killed at the Battle of Karbala. The historical context is that he and a very small, fiercely loyal group of followers faced an absolutely massive, overwhelming army of the Umayyad Caliphate.
So they were completely outnumbered.
It was, by any tactical measure, a complete suicide mission. He had no chance of military victory, but he explicitly chose to fight and die rather than submit to an authority that he viewed as deeply corrupt and fundamentally unjust. In Shia theology, Hussein is the ultimate paradigm of the martyr.
And Modad argues that this isn't just ancient, dusty history studied in seminaries. This is the active, operating psychological framework of the devout Iranian leadership, the Revolutionary Guard, and their core military base.
Precisely. Their guiding geopolitical principle, directly derived from the story of Karbala, is death over humiliation. To surrender, to capitulate to Western demands or Israeli pressure out of fear of a military strike, would be viewed internally as abandoning the legacy of Hussein all over again. It is considered a fundamental religious betrayal. So when the West applies the madman theory, when they rattle sabers and act unpredictably, they are fundamentally miscalculating the psychology of their adversary.
Because you cannot bluff someone whose core defining belief system demands martyrdom over surrender.
Exactly. If you act crazy and threaten to kill them, they are philosophically prepared to act crazier because they simply do not fear death in the same materialistic way a secular Western tactician does.
It's a fascinating strategic blind spot. You can't threaten a genuine martyr with death. It doesn't deter them. It just actively validates their worldview and strengthens their resolve.
Exactly. The threat is seen as an opportunity for glory. And this deep disconnect brings us to Modad's broader, intensely philosophical critique of this entire geopolitical era. Modad evaluates all of this statecraft through a strict Christian moral framework.
He does.
He argues that modern Western policymaking is entirely, completely unprincipled. It has abandoned any sense of Christian morality, or really any traditional humanistic morality, in favor of raw, psychopathic self-interest, financial extraction, and the deliberate generation of chaos.
And to really illustrate the absolute depth of this moral decay, the sources bring in a truly powerful, evocative literary analogy, Dante's Inferno.
It is a striking, haunting comparison to end on. In Dante Alighieri's 14th century vision of hell, you descend through various concentric rings, each punishing a different, progressively worse type of sin. You have rings for lust, for gluttony, for greed.
Right.
You might naturally assume that the absolute bottom, the deepest, worst place in hell, is reserved for mass murderers or violent, bloody tyrants burning forever in a lake of fire.
Right, that's the cultural image we all have of hellfire and violence, but it's not.
No. The ninth and lowest circle of hell in Dante's vision is called posits. And it isn't a fiery lake, it is a frozen, completely immobilized, desolate lake of ice. And the
Face.
sinners trapped in that ice, chewed on by Lucifer himself, are not there for crimes of hot passion or physical violence. They are there for the sin of treachery.
Treachery. Deep, calculated betrayal.
Yes, those who betray their family, their guests, their country, or their benefactors. At the very center of this frozen lake is Judas Iscariot, the ultimate betrayer. Dante, and by extension Modad, views treachery as the coldest, most calculated, and absolutely most unforgivable sin because it destroys the very foundational bonds of trust, loyalty, and love that hold any human society together.
And Modad takes this 700-year-old literary concept and maps it directly onto the modern elite oligarchy we've been discussing. He views this class of asset managers, defense contractors, and captured politicians not just as greedy or misguided, but as fundamentally treacherous.
Treacherous to the core.
They are actively betraying the citizens they are supposed to govern and protect. They are betraying the fundamental social contract. By purposefully pushing the youth into a lifetime of debt slavery, by destroying the purchasing power of the working class through inflation to fund foreign proxy wars, and by intentionally manipulating the media to blind the public to their actions, they are committing high treason against their own people.
It's a heavy accusation.
I want to ask a final philosophical question here because we have covered so much heavy ground today. Looking at everything we've mapped out, can a modern nation-state truly operate on theology, honesty, and strict morality? Or does the brutal, anarchic, hyper-competitive game of global geopolitics always force leaders to abandon their principles just to survive the wolves?
Yeah, that's the real dilemma.
Is it even possible to be a moral superpower? Or is chaos as policy simply the dark, inevitable reality of how you maintain dominance in a dangerous world?
It is the eternal, agonizing question of statecraft. But Modad's answer, derived from his framework, is profound. He insists that true leadership requires the maintenance of moral order, not the cynical manufacturing of chaos. He quotes a deeply resonant proverb in the text: "Injustice is of lesser consequence than no government."
Wow, let's really think about the weight of that. Injustice is of lesser consequence than no government.
What he means is that even a flawed, somewhat corrupt, or partially unjust system of order is still vastly better for the poor, the weak, and the everyday citizen than a state of total anarchic collapse.
A bad king who taxes you heavily is still better than a neighborhood run by a warlord with a drone swarm where your life has zero value.
Exactly. Modad's ultimate, searing condemnation of the West's chaos as policy is that it intentionally creates that absolute worst-case scenario. It deliberately destroys order for short-term financial profit, leaving the most vulnerable populations on Earth, both in the Middle East and right here at home, to suffer the devastating consequences of inflation, endless war, and societal breakdown.
Which brings us to the end of this incredibly dense, challenging, and illuminating deep dive. We started by peeling back the illusion of diplomacy, how nuclear negotiations are allegedly used as tactical cover to prepare for strikes against conventional vulnerabilities, as seen in the Omani talks.
We moved into the terrifying mechanics of chaos as policy, exploring the deliberate fostering of failed states and debt traps to create a buffer of dysfunction, leading to the terrifying prospect of a million little Saddams armed with modern technology.
We explored the massive, looming economic threat of the Samson option in the Strait of Hormuz, detailing how an asymmetric drone war could instantly sever the world's energy lifeline, trigger hyperinflation, and collapse the remittance-dependent economies of the Global South.
And we traced the ultimate beneficiaries of this chaos back to an entrenched elite oligarchy, analyzing how asset managers profit through defense contracts and maintain their grip on power through media consolidation and a systemic cycle of war, migration, and domestic debt slavery.
All of this culminating in a profound moral void, where the calculated, treacherous betrayal of the everyday citizen has become standard operating procedure. We have unpacked Modad's worldview from the geopolitical top to the domestic bottom. And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought that builds on the mechanics of everything we've discussed today. We've talked extensively about how entire economies, educational systems, and foreign policies are allegedly being meticulously engineered to support perpetual conflict through inflation and student debt.
The extraction of wealth and agency from the bottom to the top?
Exactly. So if this financial and geopolitical system continues unabated, operating exactly as designed, how long until the very concept of a sovereign, debt-free, politically independent citizen becomes completely obsolete? Are we merely witnessing the end of traditional statecraft and diplomacy, or are we witnessing the deliberate, managed end of the independent individual?
It is a question that demands serious, uncomfortable reflection from all of us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep questioning the narratives you are handed, to look closely at the underlying mechanics of the policies affecting your life, and to navigate these muddy waters for yourself. Until next time.